Welcome to a special virtual edition of the Skeptics track at Dragoncon, where we put the science in science fiction.
Hi, welcome to the live Skeptic track with Dragoncon, streaming from Calico Cove Studios. Thank you very much. I'm your assistant track director, Dr. Angie. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Dana Bevan, who is this will be her fourth presentation at Dragoncon, even if it is virtual. Thank you for joining us today, Dana. Happy to see you. She is the transgender scientist.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I wish it was under different circumstances, but we'll have a go at it.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Okay. So can I put the first slide, please? Okay, this just is the title slide. My aim here is to give you an idea about why people are transgender, and to talk about how it's been a facet of my life for as long as I've lived. So next, please. So we start out with this young lad in 1952. And that's me, of course. And that's the dining room of my family dining room. And for some reason, African violets always required tinfoil. They're in the background there. But that was where my mother graded papers. She was a third grade school teacher. And so one day I went up to her and, well, I know pretty much when this is because the balloon says Merry Christmas. And so it's got to be 1952-ish Christmas. So I was 5. And don't do the calculation because. But so I went up to her and I told her that I was a girl and not a boy, and she didn't like that much. But third grade school teachers are pretty much unflappable. You know, they have all kinds of things happen to them and all kinds of children talking about things. And so she told me that that couldn't possibly be true. That I was a male, and in our family, if you are a male, you are required to do certain things. And of course I said, well, what am I required to do? And she said, well, you got to go in the military, and you have to get good grades, and you have to raise a family, and you have to be in athletics. And I said, okay, I can do all those as a girl. And then she said, but if you tell anyone, they'll put you in the mental institution. At the time, there was a chain of state mental institutions in all the states, and they would put people in these institutions for all kinds of things, including being transgender. So she said, you must never tell anyone. And I said, well, I want to be a real girl. And she said, well, you can't change your sex. And so we'll come back to this in a little while. Could I have the next view? So I did all the things that my mother told me to. As you can see here, I won't read them, but so I did, I got a pretty good education. At the time, those were all male schools, I should mention, which was a fun time. And I'm an independent scientist. I'm not part of academia, although I was for a while. And mainly I write books and deal with volunteer work. So I was in the Army Medical Service Corps, so I served my military career out, 3 years on active duty. I have 3 grandchildren, three biological grandchildren, so I've contributed to the gene pool. More about that later. I actually played intercollegiate football and refereed football when I left school. If you can imagine me in a referee's outfit, but I guess that's possible. And then I rose to the rank of professor at Georgia Tech. So I did all things that my mother expected me to do, I guess. But I was still unhappy because I was still secretly cross-dressing whenever I could, and feeling that I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. But at the same time, I'm a scientist by inclination, and so I really wanted to understand why I was the way I was and the way I am. So I spent a long time looking for information, and not most of it. Well, there really wasn't much information until about the 1980s or 90s, so in 2004, I started digesting anything I could find on being transgender. So the next few graphs, please. So a couple of background things, and these are, when you call in, they say our settings have changed. These are my definitions. Other people will define things differently. But these are the ones that seem most consistent and most scientific to me. A couple of definitions. One is, which may seem obvious, but it's not, is what is sex? And what happens is when you're born, the doctor whacks you on the behind and looks between your legs and assigns you to one of two sex categories. There are exceptions to that, of course. But when that happens, people assume that your external genitalia infer your ability to reproduce either as a male or a female. That, of course, is not true. There are lots of people that cannot reproduce successfully, even though their external things look like they should. And people don't ever really much do karyotyping or genetic analysis. That is, very few people ever have their chromosomes looked at or their genes looked at. What we do know about genes and chromosomes is incredibly complicated. We think of females having XX sex chromosomes and males having XY chromosomes. But in fact, there are all combinations of XXXY and YYYX, and furthermore, and I just found this out in the last year or so, about 20% of people don't have all their chromosomes. They typically will have, you typically will have 46, but some have 45 or 44, which is interesting that the genetic code is that tolerant. So it's really beyond the state of the art to look at someone's sex chromosomes or genetics and predict exactly what their sex will be and whether they're able to reproduce. Now, that's contrary to what most people believe, I would say. Next few graphs, please. So the other thing is that sex and gender are not the same thing. Gender is a word that was pulled out of language declensions by this gentleman here, John Money, who he had a problem because they were, at the time this is back in the late 50s and 60s, they were doing, if there was a baby with indeterminate external sex, that they'd try to quote unquote reassign them to one of convenience. Typically it was towards being female looking. And he had a problem because he had to tell parents how to raise their kid, in spite of the fact he didn't know, he didn't really know their sex and really didn't know anything about them. So he came up with this concept called gender or gender behavior or gender role. and to tell them what to do. And in a lot of cases, well, you got a 50-50 chance, right? And in some cases that failed. In particular, this little girl here, Brenda, had a long tortured history because during a circumcision accident, her genitalia got messed up, and they converted her genitalia into something looking like a female. And money told the parents to raise that child as a female, and things did not turn out well. Things to raise her as a girl, as her gender as a girl, and things did not go well. And that's a long, lurid history. That's actually a best-selling New York Times best-selling book. But what happened is that somehow people got to the idea that gender and sex were the same thing, and that gender sounded better than sex. That is, sex was a nice word, a nice polite word for gender. And now everything is all mixed up, particularly if you see it on the news or read it. And it's not just journalists, it's scientists as well who mix and match as they feel, using sex and gender incorrectly. So I stick with this definition as best I can to see where it goes. Next, please. So being transgender means that you don't behave according to the gender behavior category that you were assigned at birth. In this culture, in the Western culture, if you're assigned male at birth, you are assigned to the masculine gender category. And if you're determined to be female, you're assigned to the feminine gender category. And each of those has assigned behaviors and norms and expectations that go with it. But this is entirely based on sex, which, as we'll see, is not true in other cultures. And you can see there's a whole variety of different categories that people define themselves by that are all transgender. At least I consider them that. Other people your results may vary, but as far as I can tell, there's no reason to divide them up. So the final thing about being transgender in this culture, unlike other cultures, I should say, that because we violate gender categories, we're cultural outlaws. And you've seen enough of that, both in terms of verbal and physical abuse as well as rejection. And as we'll see, people in other gender categories in other cultures are not regarded that way. So could I have the next, please? So I've looked at all the factors that you can think of, some 22 or 23 in all, and you've heard some of them on the news. And a lot of them are bogus, a lot of them are pseudoscience, but these are the ones that seem to stick. These are factors that are involved in making someone transgender. As you can see, the first is genetics, then there's epigenetics, and I'll try to define what that means in a bit. Western culture gender behavior categories. In other cultures, they don't just have two categories, they have multiple categories, up through 5. And they don't seem to have transgender people that are outlaws or violate their gender categories, because there are enough of them that people can adapt. And then early gender learning and recognition of a behavioral predisposition you get from your genes. And I'll go into more about what a predisposition is in a minute. And then as kids learn about gender, and they learn it pretty quick, the research shows, as they go, they start to recognize which gender category and which gender behaviors fit them, the ones that they feel good about, the ones they don't like. And at some point, transgender kids just rebel against the gender category they were assigned. Next, please. So you've all heard about gender predispositions. Typically, it's predispositions for medical problems, unfortunately. That's because our research establishment is set up to deal with medical problems, and that's where the money is. So it's not always the case that they look at predispositions, particularly behavioral predispositions, as we'll see. So there's a bunch of evidence that shows that supports the idea that a genetic predisposition for one set of gender behaviors or another is existence. And the way they do that is they do several different approaches. One is twin studies. And what you find is they look at twins. Identical twins have the same DNA at conception. So they're typically thought of as having the same DNA at the start. And for identical twins, if one is transgender, then the other is transgender about 50% of the time. There are a whole bunch of studies, and they range from 35 to 65. And I just picked 50% as a number that's easy to remember. So I've been pushing it to try to get better genetic predisposition information for a bunch of years, but you don't have to take my word for it. In 2018, a group of 12 world-class geneticists came online and supported what I've been saying all along, and that's the Polderman study. Then there's other support for this idea are genetic markers. And it's been, there have been several attempts at looking at different groups of genetics markers, because looking at the whole gene is kind of a big undertaking. But recently, Thiessen, who's down the road from me at University of Georgia Medical University, he came out with, he had done a full genome scan and found that there, out of 100,000 genes or so, that there were 400 that looked like they might discriminate between transgender people. And now they're trying to digest all that information. But that study was not well funded. It only had 25 people, and we need to do better. And particularly, the NIH has rejected a couple of attempts to do, 5,000 at a time, groups of 5,000 transgender and 5,000 controls, and they've not funded it. Most recently during this administration. So it would be good to have a whole genome scan and look at where which genes seem to correlate with being transgender. And what we know so far is that most genes genes have patterned networks that work together, and so we need to look at multiple genes to figure that out. But there is support for transgender people having genes that are different from controls. Then there's handedness. You see Bruce Gender down here as in doing the decathlon. Transgender people tend to be less right-handed than other people, and indeed Bruce Jenner's throwing the javelin here with his left hand, and I believe he also threw the shot with his left hand. So, and we know that handedness is somehow genetic related, although again, there are not big bucks involved with trying to understand that. And then there's several things about anatomy and physiology that look like there are genetic correlates of being transgender. And finally, being transgender tends to run in families. When I first started going to support groups back in the late 80s, there was talk about, well, my cousin is trans and my uncle's trans and occasionally my father is trans. It turns out that that those genes do run in families, but it takes, not everybody in the family becomes transgender. It takes a certain number of genes pointing in the right direction or the wrong direction, depending on your point of view, to make someone transgender. And here you see the Wachowski sisters, used to be the Wachowski brothers, the producers of The Matrix and other movies, and now both of them have transitioned to becoming female. So go ahead to the next one, please. So there are other predispositions which are non-medical that you probably are familiar with, and here are two of them. One is language. Humans have a predisposition for language. We acquire signals from other people and learn how to make signals back. But it's not necessarily through the vocal cords or the oral. People speak in American Sign Language. And so it's not necessary. So language in itself is a predisposition for people. Other animals have maybe primitive versions of that, but certainly not as sophisticated. And then handedness. Most people think of it's, you're either right-handed or you're left-handed, but the people that have, looked into this more detail, see what they do is they take a set of, say, 20 tasks and determine which ones of those people do with their right hand and which of those they do with their left hand. So it's not just all or one. Most people don't do everything with their right hand or their left. Now I myself I throw right, I swing left, and I hit a golf ball left-handed. So it's again, it's a mix of things. And for transgender people, they tend to do more with their left hand than with their right. And we do know that there's some genetic information about heritability of handedness. So then there's this thing called epigenetics, which is kind of a new concept in the last few years. It turns out that the 100,000 genes in the genome in the DNA are not all that you get from your parents or or the environment. There are these things called epigenetic factors that can change the DNA or change how it's converted into instructions for the body. As they say, it changes how DNA is expressed. So we know that, as we just talked about, only 50% of the time a person, identical twins with the same DNA, only 50% of the time have the same gender or are transgender. So so it is possible to block being transgender, like it's possible to block other traits. And here are two examples here. The girls look pretty much the same, although you can see a few small subtle differences. One girl's nose is a little bit bigger, but of course they've made them up to look as much the same as possible. But on the right-hand side, those are identical twin boys, and you can see that they look quite different in terms of their bodies, and maybe and maybe other factors. So My daughter, who's an OBGYN and catches babies for a living, I brought this up to her, and she said, "Oh yeah, they're sometimes they're all, they're different, and they're not identical in every respect and every trait." So there is a factor here which we don't know a whole lot about yet. What scientists are working on now is something called the epigenome, which is all the chemicals involved with epigenetic factors, and trying to understand how they interact with TNA. Now, some of these are external. Some of them have been suggested, like exposure to prenatal hormones and exposure to toxic chemicals. The evidence for both of those is pretty poor. Again, this is I should explain, these are photographs from my first video blog, the inaugural one, which will be coming up soon. So I spend a whole episode talking about epigenetic factors that have been suggested that don't really look like they have evidence to support them. That's not to say they're not it's not possible they're involved, but the evidence just isn't very good. Come to the next, please. Cultural factors. Western culture is somewhat unique. It's binary. There are masculine and feminine genders, and that's it. Cisgender actually is the opposite of transgender, meaning that your sex and gender are aligned in culturally acceptable ways, and it's inflexible. If you violate the rules, why people don't like that and don't accept that. But that's not the case in other cultures. Some cultures don't just have 2 categories; they have 3 to 5. And I'll give you some examples over here on the right. And some of them use childhood behavior and dream states, interpretation of dreams, not just the sex that they're born, to assign these kids to these multiple gender categories. So over on the right here, you see Wiwa is an example. Wiwa was a 3rd gender Zuni person who lived in Arizona and was the 3rd gender was he was male at birth, but she practiced the skills of basket weaving and fabric making and blanket making, to the point where now I should explain that I've been trying to figure out what pronouns they used for Wiwa, and for the life of me, I don't know that these have pronouns. So forgive me if I'm wrong, but he went to Wiwa got picked up by a publicist in Arizona and ended up going to Washington, D.C. and meeting Grover Cleveland. And a lot of his best work is, or her best work, is in the Smithsonian. But, and most people have heard of Two-Spirit people. And I just assumed, and when Wiwa would go back home, he would fight battles in his male garb. So, in fact, had a few kills to his credit. I'm not sure who they were fighting with, but back then everybody was fighting with everybody. So, but these people were in fact not Two-Spirit, not in the sense that it's offered today. The third gender category, while they spent most of their time in this feminine garb, when it came time to go to war, they would change into warrior garb. And they had a specific role. They weren't just another warrior. They had a specific role of being a strategist and a medicine man, and some of them actually led tribes in that regard. So, I met a guy named Ken Dollarhide, who was a Lakota Indian. He explained all this to me and explained why all the claptrap book about third gender, about being in two genders, or two spirits, really wasn't quite true. At any rate, so this is an example of Lakotas, and the bottom is the example of Indonesia of the warrior, and Evie is a third gender category as well. And Evie had the fun of being the nanny for Barack Obama when his mother and Barack Obama were in Indonesia. And these people, while they're accepted, they are not allowed to do other kinds of occupations. They're kind of because Western cultures encroach so much, they are kind of pushed into certain jobs and certain categories. So these are just a few. There are lists and lists of these things, and I can, and I have some favorites, which I can tell you about. But in general, there's a cultural factor here, and that is kids learn the gender behavior that they're supposed to learn from culture, and they also learn, transgender kids also learn both genders if they need to, or lots of genders. Have the next, please. And then early learning's a factor. You can't be transgender unless you know something about gender. And kids learn fundamentals by age 2 or 3, in spite of what their parents think. They're obviously not noticing that the kids adapt modes of speech and behavior for the appropriate gender by watching people and by being instructed by their parents. So you know that, of course, that pink and blue, there's no reason why girls have to wear pink and boys have to wear blue. And in fact, if anything, before World War I, it was just the opposite. So all the things that we dress our kids in and color their all their belongings, that's purely arbitrary. It has nothing at all to do with predisposition. It's all cultural. So about age 4 or 5, what happened to me, I knew about both genders, but I recognized that I was not the gender that I'd been assigned to. And it's just that simple. It's not that simple, actually, but it's not a choice. It's just recognition that that's where I belong. Now, some people know there's something wrong at that age, but don't realize what it is until they're teenagers or later. But most kids do by age of 7. Anyway. Now, recently, there's been a lot of stuff about what do you do with a transgender kid? And there's been a lot of talk about, well, they don't really know what they're all confused. The studies show that they're not confused. They know precisely what these gender behaviors are. Now, of course, they don't know anything about sex yet. That comes later. But the current way of handling this is to let them be what they want to be, and which ruffles a bunch of feathers in lots of places. More about that later. Also, it ruffles J.K. Rowling's feathers. So we can talk about that in a bit. Come to the next, please. So here's a summary of the of the factors. There's a genetic gender behavior predisposition that from DNA that looks like it's got good support from twin studies and genetic studies and biomarkers from other gender-related things. But that does not always lead to someone being transgender, because there are epigenetic factors that change the DNA or change how it's expressed. So for a person to be transgender, there has to be what I call epigenetic unblocking. That's actually a term in bridge, I guess. So, but the epigenetics that are out there don't interfere with formation of gender behavior predisposition. And then the third factor, of course, is that if you're in Western culture, you got a better chance of being determined to be transgender than in other cultures, because other cultures have more than two categories, and a lot of cultures are a little more tolerant of those kinds of behaviors. So now this is to try to ruffle the feathers of feminists. I agree with them that gender is a cultural construct, but I don't stay with them in terms of their understanding of biology. And then finally, the being transgender is not a conscious choice. It's not. It occurs during gender learning and recognition of which behaviors and which categories fit that person. That's very subtle, but it's not a conscious choice. It's something that's unconscious and deeply felt. That's why they come out as being transgender in various sources. The next one, please. Oh yeah, so getting back to our young lad here, my mother made the mistake of teaching me how to read. And because she was she is a third grade school teacher, and she wants her kid to be able to read, right? So yeah, and around the house in 1952 or thereabouts, there were lots and lots of magazines about this lady over here. Christine Jorgensen had been a GI in World War II. Not a particularly outstanding one, but one in good standing, an honorable discharge. She decided that she was going to change her sex. And she couldn't do it in the United States because we prohibited it here, particularly in certain states. But it turned out she had joint citizenship in Denmark. So she went over there and got her hormones and got her operation, and came back as a celebrity. And she did much the same stuff that Caitlyn Jenner does in terms of performing and being a celebrity. Well, so I went back to my mom and I said, well, she changed. What about me? And my mom had to back off a little bit and said, well, when you're older, maybe you can do that. But right now you need to, stick with what I told you. So that's that story. And these are my 4 books. This is shameless self-promotion. The first book is an auto science biography of part of my search for trying to figure out scientifically what I was. And the second book is a very heavy science book with about 800 references that goes through all the stuff I found in about 10 years. Being Transgender is a book for transgender people that helps explain who they are based on the science. And then this last book is a book for providers primarily, to guide them in dealing with transgender people. So here is my contact information. And there's the next graph. And I have a fledgling website, a podcast, which has about a dozen oral presentations. I blog monthly at a site called TG Forum for Transgender Forum. That's my contact information. And forthcoming, I'm going to have a YouTube blog. And some of these view graphs, as you can tell, are in preparation for that. So I thank you for your attention, and if I can answer any questions you have, I'd be glad to do it.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, as usual. You mentioned that there were some media mentionings with J.K. Rowling. What does the media get wrong? The wrongest, I guess.
Well, let's see. Or what does J.K. Rowling get wrong?
Okay, well, sure.
Well, transgender kids are becoming all politicized now because there are feminist groups that she's caught in a crossfire between, as best I can tell. There are feminist groups that say you're born to be, a female or a male. They don't say it that way, but that's what they mean. And then there are other feminist groups that say you're a tabula rasa when you're born, and you learn all the bad stuff that culture teaches you about sex and gender as you grow up. And she's kind of tossed back and forth between them. And so as a result of that, she is in a group that's attacking what's called affirmative treatment for trans kids, wherein you give them a chance to try out that gender category without changing them. And then later on, and you can do that up until puberty starts. Because when puberty starts, transgender people start panicking. Transgender kids start panicking because their breasts are growing and other things are growing. And they're afraid that they're going to be marred for the rest of their life and unable to be in the gender that they want to be in. So these days, what they do is they give those kids drugs to delay puberty only until age 16, and only when puberty starts, and only until age 16 to give them a chance to try out that gender category to see whether they want to change sex or whether they want to let nature take its course and stay with their assigned gender. So that's the kind of the current standard of care for transgender kids. And notice that they don't get surgeries typically until 18, and they don't get hormones, final hormones, until after age 16. But there's this big brouhaha in England, and to some extent here, or whether that's an acceptable way to treat kids. To which I replied, "It's none of their business." The kids literally, some of those kids would be dead because the suicide rate is incredibly high. So you pick one risk versus another.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to. Melanie in the chat says that she has seen an uptick of new parents planning to raise their new children as gender neutral. And what are your thoughts on this?
That's going to be very hard because as soon as they start, it might be in the age of COVID-19, it might be better, might be easier. But as soon as they start seeing other people who are gendered, if I can use that word. They're going to start observing their behavior, and although the parents may not instruct them about what gender they're supposed to be, they learn by observation. In fact, we know that if you observe somebody else's behavior, that some of the same kinds of neural events occur, and some people are pretty good at it. I mean, some dancers can watch a move and immediately go do it. Some more than others, but I'm not one of those. But it's going to be hard as soon as they start getting out in society to not try to observe those behaviors and pick up what the gender categories in the culture are. Pay your money and take your choice. I guess you can raise your kids the way you want to raise them.
Yeah. You mentioned that the Western cultural encroachment limited jobs in certain of these cultures that do have provision for a third gender. Is it starting to limit the gender definitions in these cultures, or are you seeing that the Western cultures in those areas are more open to that?
Well, the Western culture encroaches on the local culture. Mm-hmm. There are lots of examples of that. One is the Polynesian gender categories, and they had a third gender category for people who were kind of historians and kind of shamans, like the third gender in Western United States. And that culture got dispersed because of the atom bomb tests in the 50s. They got routed and sent to Hawaii. And then in other places, the Western culture gets, it puts pressure on other people in the society to stop accepting third gender people. And in some cases, like in Evie's case, they can only be nursemaids or other things. And in Thailand, there's a big market for transgender, really kids, to perform. And actually in Thailand, there's a big, what would you call it? Sex travel thing going on. And in other cases, they're just, the Western culture has just pushed them out of consideration. So now I understand there's a pushback now, say in the Middle East, there's a pushback now to change that West, because they don't regard Western culture as being for them anyway. So they're trying to get back to a position where they feel like they're in the right place.
Okay. So John asks, as a scientist, did your scientific understanding play a role in deciding to become transgender? I think you mentioned that from a very young age.
Right.
But did it help alleviate any sort of fear or uncertainty when you did decide to do it?
Well, my big push was, yes, not quite the way he said it, but when I was considering transitioning, I guess you'd call it due diligence. I wanted to understand everything I could from a rational scientific point of view about transitioning and being transgender. And that was a big push for me, starting maybe in the early 90s. So it didn't make me transgender, but it certainly was something I wanted to do.
Okay. So the one of the other questions that we had was why are Great Britain and Australia second wave academic feminists less likely to accept trans women into their ranks than American ones?
Well, the short answer is you have to ask them because there are all kinds of those folks. And some of them regard, the fundamentals are, in the United States, that some feminists reject trans women as not being real women, and making a mockery about what a woman is. That's part of it. But there's also there's a deeper thing going on in Australia and the UK in terms of, there's the feminist part, but there's also, here, the concern about bathrooms, that they don't want trans women going in bathrooms, in bathrooms marked for female people, because they feel that that's a threat. But in fact, the truth is that both here and there, as far as I've been able to read, and I read the papers like a hawk on these issues, no transgender person has ever accosted or sexually harassed another person, a cisgender person, in a bathroom or restroom. Now, it is true that transgender people have been beaten up and slurred and in bathrooms, but that's from cisgender people, non-transgender people. So it only works one way.
Yeah. Well, as long as they wash their hands, I don't care where they go. It's fine.
Sounds reasonable to me.
Just wash your hands. That's the only thing I ask. Anybody can sit beside me. I don't care. Just wash your hands. So, is the genetic research that you mentioned in regards to the transgender genetic predisposition taken mostly from the U.S. and Europe, or have there been genetic research done in other countries among these third gender individuals?
Not among the third gender individuals. It's been done on Western culture transgender people in a couple other locations. I think the Australians have done some work, but it's minor stuff. It's they're looking at 5 different genes as opposed to the 100,000 genes that are out there. And they also have a bias about sex. They tend to look for genes that we know are associated with sex, at least to some extent. And that's not where they should be looking. They should be looking in other places. They should look there too, but but the main thing here is that there's a group it's an international group, and they've been trying to get funding to do large-scale whole genome studies, and they've been cut off. Although actually they have all the samples. They have something like 10,000 samples of transgender and non-transgender people. And all they got to do is and these days genetic tests are pretty cheap, but they're not being funded.
That's a shame. Let's see if there are any other questions. You mentioned Caitlyn Jenner, and how do you feel about the recognition that she's gotten by being a transgender celebrity?
If I had advised her at the beginning, I would have told her to come out a little slower. She didn't know what she didn't know, and that's true of a lot of trans people, particularly Caitlyn and other people who are very sheltered. I guess she had some friends who were trans, but she didn't really know what she was doing. And so she was thrust into the limelight. And I didn't think that was good for her, and I didn't think that was good for transgender people.
Well, so how can cisgender supporters help to support people who are transgender? What can those who are not transgender do to support those who are?
Well, a lot of things. I mean, not allowing people to slur transgender people, I guess, is one that pops up immediately. But just being tolerant of trans people, not firing them from jobs, you know,
Yes.
is another one. And trying to get over their cultural bias against trans people. Now, I live in the South, and there are a whole bunch of people down here that don't like transgender people much, including some medical people. And I've experienced some of them, and some of my friends have too. So they've got to just get it out of their system, or try to get people who don't really understand get it out of their system. Laws help, but in order to flourish, transgender people are going to have approval from the culture, and to be able to be, all that they can be as human beings. And right now we don't have that.
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes because I'm an emergency physician, and I have patients periodically who will come in for who are transgender but are there for maybe non-related issues. And I had an incident where I had to do X-rays or something, and the patient was female to male transition, and I knew that. He was presenting in a very masculine fashion, but said female still on the chart because he hadn't undergone any actual chemical treatment yet. He was planning on it, but it hadn't popped up yet. But because we were in a rural area, he didn't publicize that very often. And so I said, I did go back and say, I see on your chart that you're listed as female, but you're presenting very masculine. And are you? And I try very hard to be sensitive to that, and say, do you prefer masculine or feminine pronouns? And he said, will you still take care of me if I am? And it broke my heart that someone would go through somebody's mind. And I said, no, I just want to be sensitive and call you by the pronoun that you prefer. But it's heartbreaking that people have to live with that sort of thing every day.
Yeah, and there actually are a lot, actually the great majority of trans people that aren't out, and they need to be, when their families arrive, doctors and medical people need to understand that they shouldn't tell their their family that they're transgender, because what happens, of course, is that transgender people know that. And they don't admit to taking hormones, or they don't admit to, and there may be contraindications of taking hormones with whatever they have. So there's also this thing called the transgender broken arm syndrome among medical people, and actually the Royal College of Physicians in the UK has come out warning physicians about this, and that is when transgender people come in with a broken arm or a broken leg or other things that are totally unrelated to being transgender. There are some young medical people that want to immediately say, well, you broke your arm because you were transgender. Here, let me put you in my study, and we'll try to cure that by curing your transgender behavior. So there are actually, when I was writing my last book, I talked to some doctors, and one in particular said, you have to include instructions for providers when a patient comes in and has nothing at all to do with being transgender. But people need to, when their chief complaint is not being transgender, and they have to know what to do, and no one gets taught that in medical school. In most medical schools, they have a grand total of 1 hour on transgender patients.
That's more than I had, and I've mostly been taught by my patients. This particular person had it like an ankle something, and we had to get an x-ray, which is why it even
Yeah.
came up. I never would have even brought it up because it was not relevant to their care.
Right.
But yeah, anyway. So, well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm absolutely delighted to talk with you again. Thank you for joining us as part of this virtual stream. And can you show us where we can find you again?
It's the last slide.
Yep.
I'm going to be on there. Yeah, there we go. That's my website. It's all the Transgender Scientist, to make it easy. And my podcast is out. It's on wherever you get podcasts, and my books are all out wherever you get them. One caveat about my books is my name changed. So two of my books are not Dana Bevan. They're Thomas Bevan, which is my old name.
Okay. Well, thank you. Oh, please. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, I'm done.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching us on the live streaming Skeptrack Dragoncon. These videos are on skeptrack.com. And thank you, Mark Ditzler and Calico Cove Studios. Coming up next at 7 o'clock, we have Benjamin Radford, who will be telling us about the phantom clown panics. So we hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
As fun as all this streaming content is, we sincerely cannot wait to see you all in person again next year. Remember to stay healthy and safe until then. Wear a mask when interacting with other people out in the real world. Want more Skeptrack? Get more than 10 years of Skeptics track programming at our video archive, video.skeptrack.org.